Today is October 24th, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just announced a federal tax on carbon.
Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Headlines. You're listening to The Weekly, our straight-to-podcast show discussing current events and their policy implications. My name is Dimitri Trehelis, and on the panel today we have...
My name is Vienna.
Hi, my name is Alex.
Great. So today we'll be discussing Justin Trudeau's Federal Carbon Tax Act. What are sort of the specifics of that?
Right. So Prime Minister recently announced a federal tax on provinces that have not yet instituted their own climate plan. Basically, a deadline was set, and now the federal government will be instituting this plan in the remaining provinces that do not yet have one. So kind of just of it, the basic detail is the price of carbon will be starting at $10 per ton and rising to $50 a ton by 2022.
Yeah.
And this is all starting April 1st, 2019, right?
Right, and I think that was a bit of a delay to try and give a bit more time considering the recent political climate and recent changes with some of the provincial climate plans across the country.
So the provinces that this will be imposed in will be Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then also Yukon and Nunavut and PEI are adopting the system voluntarily.
And what's interesting, I think, is that this plan was started as a backup plan and is now going to be covering close to 47% of Canadians. So basically half the country now is going to be under this federal plan.
So in terms of revenue collected, how will Canadians see it coming back to them? What's the rebate system like?
The rebates will be coming back to them through their income tax. So basically, it's when you're filling up your income taxes, you'd basically fill out a section at the bottom or whatever that's just going to be carbon tax, like rebate, and then you'd get it through that. Like a check's just not going to arrive in the mail to your house.
What's noteworthy as well is that Ottawa has basically predicted that they'll be collecting around $2.3 billion in revenue generated from the carbon tax, and 90% of that will be going straight back to households in rebates, while the remaining 10% will be handed out to small, medium-sized businesses, schools, hospitals, other organizations like that. But the vast majority of the money will be going straight back in rebates.
That's really good. I think the purpose of that is to help incentivize and help support Canadians make the transition to like a lower carbon economy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about it too, say you're getting your rebate at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year, and you decided to start making more like carbon efficient choices, I guess, and trying to be more renewable energy, like that's just more money going into your pocket.
The federal government has basically predicted that 70% of people in the provinces under the federal plan will be receiving more than they pay from the rebate system. So just some numbers, about $300 a year in Ontario, $248 a year in New Brunswick, $336 a year in Manitoba, and Saskatchewan is going to be kind of the big winner, I guess, with around $600 in rebates per year.
It's based on the varying sizes of households, right? So depending if you're a bigger or smaller household income, you'll get more or less of a refund.
So, the federal government projects that just the $20 carbon tax will result in an approximate increase of about 4.42 cents a liter for gas, around 3 cents for propane, around 4 cents for natural gas. That cost will be basically translated to consumers, and that's where the idea of the rebate comes in, is that while the tax will be on the companies and on the producers themselves, that will be translated down the line to the consumers. So the rebate is a way to kind of incentivize, like we mentioned earlier, to get consumers on board with the plan.
I think Justin said in his press conference yesterday at Humber College, he said that individuals will be receiving incentive at the same time this is being implemented. So I think it should help them even more preempt to this transition. So I think that's an interesting way to see it as well.
You've seen some commentary from some of the members of the Conservative Party and from some people who are opposing the plan, some of the provinces, arguing that this will actually lead to an increase in cost for individual Canadians and families. So obviously the federal government has their facts, and that has been supported by some independent organizations as well, but there is mixed feelings across the country. Doug Ford came out in opposition, Andrew Scheer as well.
Scott Moe.
Yeah, Scott Moe. So it's definitely, it's going to be a very contentious issue going forward, and for sure will be a key issue heading into the 2019 election, which will be necessary to
Yeah, this is
watching.
definitely going to be a very contentious issue come next year for the election.
It'll definitely be a big issue. It's interesting to see how the conservative critique has been viewing the rebates or the initial incentive as a cash grab for votes it was interesting to see Justin Trudeau's response to that at Humber College yesterday.
I think, yeah, there is something interesting about the timing of the announcement. Some people might be wondering why it took so long for the federal government to really get going with this plan after the Paris Agreement on climate change.
Yeah, get into some of the timeline actually of how we got here.
Yeah.
So basically, December 2015, the parties in the UN reached their landmark agreement on combating climate change, and it was the first universal climate change agreement. And then also in 2015, so this is when Trudeau promised a national price on carbon in his campaign. And then come 2016, he told provinces that if they didn't introduce their own price on carbon, that the federal government would do it for them. So 2017 came along, and he gave the provinces a year to come up with a plan of their own that met the federal standards that they put in place for the provinces. And now we're here in 2018, and those 4 provinces, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick, have not followed through on the federal government standards, and which led him to impose his own plan.
Yeah, he really stuck to his word.
Yeah, he did.
So we just wanted to touch on the legal challenge that Saskatchewan had started against the federal government, Premier Scott Moe, and now it's been joined on by the Ontario government and Doug Ford. So basically what they're arguing is that the federal government imposing a carbon tax on the provinces oversteps federal jurisdiction, which obviously, regardless of your opinion of the nuts and bolts of the plan itself, is an important conversation. And just to touch on that, I saw some comments from Emmett McFarlane, who's a leading constitutional scholar in Canada, basically arguing that the federal government definitely has the jurisdiction to impose the tax due to their ability to raise revenue at a national level.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's an environmental issue that is cross-border, cross-provincial. So the federal government definitely does have that jurisdiction over environmental regulation.
Also, I saw a group of legal scholars from Manitoba make that same case and find that it unconstitutionally valid to make this case in front of the Supreme Court.
Which Doug Ford said he did want to do.
Which Doug Ford has committed to do, and Caroline Mulroney has been doing since Doug Ford has been elected. This has been very costly for the Ontario taxpayer, and it seems from a legal standpoint, at least from what has come out so far, it seems sort of ineffective. It won't really amount to anything, but it's a big political move. It's a big political play, regardless of the outcome.
We're joined now on the line by Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, an environmental researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Hadrian, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We just wanted to get your initial reaction to the federal government's announcement of the carbon pricing plan.
Well, my initial take is that it's a sensible policy move. It makes sense for them to go this direction. Going with the rebates is a kind of a politically savvy move because people like getting checks from the government in their mailbox, so that makes sense. But at the core, the policy is still a price on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a good thing from an environmental perspective. So overall, I think we're pleased with this announcement. Certainly, there's improvements that could be made, but it was a good step by the government.
So yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about those improvements. What is the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives kind of suggesting, and what would you like to see going forward?
Well, we've supported carbon pricing for a while, and one of the main reasons it's a great tool. I guess the main reason is that it does provide an incentive to reduce emissions, and economists love carbon pricing because it's basically the most efficient climate policy out there, the lowest cost one. But the other huge benefit of carbon pricing is the revenues it generates, which can specifically be used to further reduce emissions. And that's, I think, where the government kind of missed an opportunity here. So they're recycling, at least in these 4 provinces that are covered by the federal backstop. So that's Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Manitoba. 90% of the revenues that they generate are going to go right back to households. And again, that's good politics. Economically, it's efficient. But they could have used a portion of those revenues, as much as probably 50% or even more, and redirected those towards other climate initiatives. So, building renewable energy projects or energy efficiency initiatives and so on. And if they had done that with their revenues, you get even more greenhouse gas emissions than pricing alone. So there was an opportunity there that they didn't take advantage of.
Could you speak to a little bit more of those other projects that you'd like to see? So I know Alberta has been reinvesting some of their money raised from the carbon tax into diversifying the economy. If you look at other countries around the world, for example, Norway, they're investing a lot of their much larger carbon tax into national programs. What type of programs would you like to see?
Well, those are great examples that you mentioned, and most places that have carbon pricing do allocate a portion of revenues to climate initiatives. So that was the case in Ontario. It's kind of a mess now. Quebec does that. Quebec's done a lot of great work on electrifying the transportation system. So they use portions of their carbon pricing revenues to, on the one hand, subsidize electric vehicles, but also to build out like charging infrastructure and things like that to make it easier to use electric vehicles. BC recently has started to use some of their carbon pricing revenues for climate initiatives. So at the federal level in Canada, like the big thing, the most expensive part of transitioning is infrastructure. We spend literally tens and hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of decades on new infrastructure. And what we need is basically a wholesale changeover of our energy infrastructure in the country, and that's not going to be cheap. So that's kind of the main or the first place that I think carbon pricing revenues could be used is building up that renewable energy infrastructure, building a more interconnected electricity grid so we can handle the inconsistency of some renewable power sources. And then other initiatives are things like public transit, but not just, we think public transit, we think buses in cities, sometimes subways. Certainly that's helpful, but smaller cities need public transit options that they're usually not nearly as good as in major cities. And then also better intercity public transit options. So we have some train corridors in this country, but there's a lot of opportunities there for high-speed rail. And we've looked at projects, for example, between Calgary and Edmonton, or between basically Windsor all the way through to Quebec City. You could have high-speed passenger rail there. So projects like that, they're not cheap, but they would make a big difference from an emissions perspective, and also move us just generally towards a lower carbon economy.
I wanted to ask if you thought with moving forward, it would be a better option for the federal government to take more of a hold on climate change initiatives, or whether we should still move forward and have the provinces themselves divvy up their own climate change or carbon tax initiatives. Like, do you think like the divvy that's going on now should move in one direction or the other?
It's a great question, and I mean, climate policy aside, this is kind of a perennial issue in Canada, right? That we have actually very independent provinces. They're very strong in our kind of federation, and there's very important areas like energy policy, for example, that are very clearly provincial jurisdiction, and so it really limits what the federal government can do. I think from an efficiency perspective. The more centralized, the better when it comes to some of these climate policies. So carbon pricing works better if everyone's following the same rules, not just nationally, but also internationally. Like if we had a global carbon price, that would be the most efficient climate policy. But of course, that's not on the table. So, the kind of patchwork of policies we have in Canada is kind of the best we could manage. But yeah, I think, in a best case scenario, to answer your question, the federal backstop carbon price actually would, if that was just applied in every province in Canada, that would actually probably be an optimal outcome. But you'd have to step on the toes of all these provinces that already have carbon pricing systems and want to do different things with the revenue. So it's politically complicated, but economically, yeah, the simpler the better.
Mark Jacquard, a Simon Fraser University professor in resource and environmental management, estimates that the price of carbon in Canada would need to go up to about $200 a ton to meet the 2030 Paris Agreement targets. The IPCC report suggests maybe a price on carbon around $130 to $140 per ton. What do you kind of see as the future of carbon pricing? Where do you think it should go?
So those estimates, they're legitimate estimates, but they assume no other climate policies. So it's like if we had carbon pricing of $200 a ton and nothing else, that would get us to our targets. And in practice, we've got kind of a climate policy package across Canada and across the provinces. So things like the coal phase-out mean that we don't need as high a carbon price because we're directly tackling coal emissions in a regulatory way. But yeah, I think the future carbon pricing is that you need the price to go up. I think that's pretty straightforward. I mean, currently the federal proposal is that it goes up by $10 per ton per year. And then by 2022, we've got a $50 a ton carbon price across the country. But as you point out, that's still far short of what economists and the IPCC have called for. So the reasonable solution that we think is that you just continue to increase the price by $10 per year indefinitely. So in 2023, it's now $60 a ton and so on. Because an important part of carbon pricing to work effectively is it's got to be this predictable rising signal so that businesses make cleaner investments in the long term. And if the price plateaus, which is what we actually saw in British Columbia over the last few years, the price signal kind of gets weaker and people stop responding to it. So, yeah, I think an easy way to keep pressure on and keep moving in that direction is just to continue increasing the federal standard by $10 a year beyond 2022. I don't think we're going to see an out of the blue $200 a ton carbon tax, even if that was the best option environmentally. I don't think that's really on the table.
When you start to consider the other options put forward by prairie provinces that put forward regulatory mechanisms versus an all stops carbon tax, would you consider that a viable option when trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or do you think that's more of a regional plan that can't be extrapolated elsewhere?
No, I think it can totally work. I think the irony here, like the politics are really ironic here, because carbon pricing is basically the most conservative free market policy there is when it comes to climate policy.
Yeah.
Because what carbon pricing is saying is, like, the government's not going to tell you how to reduce emissions. You just do it your own way. Figure it out, free market. Whereas regulatory options are saying, like, no, we're the government, we're deciding which sector should do what, how each sector should reduce emissions. Either approach can work. It's just that the politics have kind of flipped here. It's kind of ironic that more conservative governments and conservative jurisdictions are saying, no, we can get by with regulation. And we have this liberal government which is saying, no, we'll take the free market, private sector kind of approach to climate policy. But yeah, to answer your question, regulation can work, absolutely. And regulation is, as Mark Jaccard and others have argued, is preferable to carbon pricing for a number of reasons, partly because you don't really see the impact necessarily on your day-to-day lifestyle. The coal phase out in Ontario, for example, that's a regulatory move. It's not a market-based move. It was saying we're going to get rid of coal in this province, and that was one of the single biggest emissions reductions initiatives in North American history. It was very successful, and that was politically palatable. To get the coal phase out using a carbon price would have required, as we discussed earlier, a $200 or $300 a ton price, which just wasn't going to happen. So regulations have a lot of advantages, and I think they're viable. They just have to be strong enough, and that's the issue I see with some of the proposals we've seen in, for example, Alberta and Saskatchewan. They're saying, no, we'll do our own regulatory approach, and that's fine, but they need to be strong regulations. Like, they need to actually drive emissions reductions, and we haven't seen that yet.
All right. Well, Hadrian, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us about this very important policy issue.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Once again, that was Hadrian Martins-Kirkwood from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, an environmental researcher there, who just joined us by phone from Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So with the federal carbon tax comes a projected increase in the price of gas. I think that's like 4 cents per liter, or is it like 3.9 or something?
It was 4.42 cents a liter for gasoline.
Yeah. So with that increase in gasoline, consumers are going to be paying more at the pump, and that may lead to an incentivization to buy electrical vehicles or hybrid vehicles. Do you guys think it's enough of an incentive to make that switch, or do you think it's just going to lead to people getting angry at the pumps?
I think at the beginning, people are just definitely going to get angry at the increase in gas prices. You see that all over the news every time there's an increase in gas prices anyways. Maybe later on down the line, you'd have more of an incentive to start eventually looking into alternative options for your means of transportation, whether that means taking public transit more, whether that means investing in hybrid cars and stuff like that. I know for Ontario, there was a rebate though with hybrid cars that you would get if you would purchase one with, and then you would get the rebate from the provincial government. Sorry.
Yeah, that was the whole Tesla lawsuit.
Yeah, it was, and I think that's also interesting to consider too, because I feel like that might have been more of an incentive to go out and purchase a hybrid car, where this might be a bit of a longer process in order to get there.
I think that what we need is a national conversation about moving the dialogue forward. Besides, the couple cents per ton increase in gas prices, which are important. Those do have real effects on people. But we're at a point now where the IPCC report that's now infamous came out, almost a month ago. Mm-hmm. We've seen what the effects of rising greenhouse gas emissions will have, and rising temperatures will have on our country and on the world. And it's time for a national shift in that mentality, right? So, you look just at the carbon pricing themselves. It's being supported by Canadians for Clean Prosperity, the Pembina Institute, tons of think tanks and institutes across the country.
Definitely.
It's being adopted in many countries around the world with far higher prices at the initial onset. There's so much more we have to do, and maybe it's not realistic to assume that we'll move to a higher carbon price going forward. Maybe we'll plateau, and I know there are different perspectives on that, but if it's changing individual habits, right, and starting to use green vehicles and hybrid vehicles, or it's retrofitting old buildings and moving into certification, it's steps we need to take.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And it's going back to what Hadrian was saying, to how the larger scale that you're doing this on, the more effective it actually will be.
Yeah.
So if you're doing this nationally, you're doing this globally, it'll have more of an effect than if we're just doing it for a few provinces now. It's more of a collective effort to get us to a new point.
And I think Justin Trudeau made it pretty clear in his statement yesterday that the federal government is here to work as a supportive mechanism to help Canadians in this transition to a lower carbon economy.
And just in terms of that argument, right, of the incentives, so it may be financially upfront, it won't be great, but if you look at economic growth in this country, the 4 provinces, well, I guess 3 now, but until recently 4 provinces that had carbon pricing had the highest economic growth,
Definitely,
right? And BC's had carbon pricing for a long time. Alberta recently introduced it, and there's obvious returns there that are going to the people. So maybe right away people won't see the benefits, but they will start to come, and the incentives will be there in a couple of years at least.
Yeah, and even the Nobel Peace Prize winner who advocated for carbon pricing used BC's economy and carbon pricing scheme as a model example, because not only are they pricing carbon, but their GDP is increasing at the same time.
Right.
So now we're joined on the line from David McLaughlin from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Hi, David. How's it going?
It's going fine, thank you.
No problem. So Justin Trudeau just introduced the federal carbon tax yesterday. We'd love to hear your initial reactions on it.
Well, short and long-term reactions. We're going to have a carbon tax and climate change election.
That's right.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the news reports and the way that this has all been talked about and discussed that this is going to be a big political issue for Canadians over the next year. So any young people and any students who are concerned about climate change and want something to be done, this is going to be a motivating issue. So that's my first message. If you care about climate change, pay attention to this issue and think about how you're going to vote next time out.
Definitely.
It's a big move for Canada. We've talked a lot about addressing climate change. We've had governments that have put targets out there and said, we should reach the Kyoto target. And then we had, for a while, the Copenhagen target. Now we have Paris targets. What we haven't had is really a plan to get there.
Yeah.
To actually get the carbon emission reductions to stop climate change that we need to have. And so, we haven't really kept our word as certainly governments and as citizens who have a responsibility, but then also as a country that is trying to contribute to a global solution. So it was a big move to really have a federal government say, you know what, we're going to actually impose carbon pricing on those provinces that don't come up, with their own plan, because we got to do this. We got to finally take on climate change, and the best way to reduce emissions is have a carbon price. So it's not going to be pretty in terms of the politics, but in terms of actually getting emission reductions and trying to do something about climate change. Let's maybe a year from now we'll be all saying, what was the fuss all about? It's done. Let's go.
So, David, you mentioned the political battle that's upcoming over climate change earlier. You're currently the Director of Climate Change for the IISD. You previously have worked for numerous progressive conservative governments. You're a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. So, obviously, you have a bit of an understanding of the political arena as well. What do you think is needed to shift the dialogue in Canada? You have the federal Conservative Party and a couple of the provinces now coming out strongly against the the carbon pricing plan?
Well, I think we've had that first shift actually just happening yesterday, because it's now real for people. If there was any doubt as to whether or not the carbon pricing and a carbon tax was actually going to be coming, it's now real. The federal government has said so, and the federal government said, you know what, we're going to run on this. In the sense, we're prepared to sort of make this an issue. So for voters and for citizens, it's they say it just got real, because we're going to have to make some choices on it. The other thing that makes it real, in sort of political terms, is the way that the federal government is rebating the money back. So, you have a choice when you get all this new carbon revenue. What do you do with it? You can invest it in infrastructure. You invest it in clean tech or public transit and things like that. You can reduce income taxes. You can put it into healthcare, frankly, if you like. There's nothing. It's just money. It comes into the government. They can do what they want with it. But really, the public has a kind of a sniff test, a tolerance level as to what it'll accept for a new tax. And the fact that the money is going back to them through these rebates is politically a much better way to go, in my view. I mean, there may be more efficient, quote unquote, economically efficient ways to do things, but you can't tax people in a democracy if they don't agree. So there has to be societal acceptance for this. So that's the second part, and therefore they've done that, I think, with these rebates. The third thing that they've done, which I think is, or the third thing that I think is going to play, not so much on their choice, is I think increasingly people are getting attuned to the fact that climate change is real and it's happening. So we're seeing more events going on, and like we don't get hurricanes here per se, but we had a tornado in Ottawa the other month. And we can't say it's directly related to climate change, but it is extreme weather. And people are starting to notice these things as they pile up. So, who knows what we're going to see over the next year in terms of wild weather and extreme climate events. That will have an impact on people, too.
David, do you think that the rebate that you just described, the 90% going back to consumers and the 10% going to social infrastructure like schools or hospitals, do you think that's enough for the average Canadian to incentivize and help support them make a shift to a low-carbon choice? Or do you think they need more of a supportive mechanism?
Well, I think it's, let me reframe it a bit. I think it's enough, although we'll see. It's probably enough to get them to at least hold their nose and accept a carbon tax. I mean, let's go back to the politics of what's trying to do. It is really hard to impose a new tax and a new pricing mechanism like this in Canada today, and so that's just where we're at as a country for the most part. So, if there's an old saying, or that song, right? You need a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down. Well, carbon pricing is our medicine. The sugar is the rebate. So if you don't have that, then you don't have a chance of getting carbon pricing in place, and you don't have much of a chance of getting emissions down in a meaningful way. So that's the political virtuous circle, if you will, that we're into. It's not So the first answer is I think it helps with acceptance by people, maybe grudging, but it's there. How do you then get emissions down is sometimes a different piece. Now, if you're getting money back from the government, for your carbon emissions, you say, well, look, I'll just keep, doing what I'm doing. I'll just keep getting this kind of, rebate or something, except that, I can actually keep more of the rebate, which is meant to cover my carbon cost impacts, if I actually reduce my carbon footprint more. So I'll turn the heat down more. I'll drive less. I'll take public transit, and really, then I'm not spending the rebate that I'm getting. And you get the rebate in advance. You're going to get a rebate on. I'm going to get as an Ontario resident. I'm going to get a rebate. For April 1st when I file my tax return. For next year. Well, I haven't used any winter heat. Well, I've used a little, but I mean, for the year, I haven't. I haven't actually had the carbon tax applied. So it's like a prebate, if you will. So you got to use the price signal. You got to let that sort of work through, and then people are going to have to change their behavior. But the other part of it is you got to get emissions down by companies, big industries, and businesses. And that's the other part you talked about, the 90-10 piece. And so the carbon tax is going to hit small business, small and medium-sized businesses for sure. And what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to pass through the cost as best they can. Well, they can do that more now that you and I have a rebate to help pay for some of that. So there's some opportunity to cover those costs. But also the federal government has said, here's this 10% of the money. We'll set it aside for something for small businesses, and then, as you say, the public infrastructure for the municipalities, universities, hospitals, and stuff like that. So we haven't seen the detail. We haven't seen the programming the feds are going to put behind that. But let's assume that it's sensible. It does helps do the job. Then we presume those companies and that will be incented to reduce their emissions. And that's we have to see. There's lots of evidence. There's lots of good programming out there that can do that. Yeah, but you got to marshal it to help the companies take advantage of it. Things like energy efficiency and retrofits and stuff like that. There are ways to do it. We know what to do. We just haven't been really kind of challenged to do it or sort of spark plug to do it. Well, a carbon tax is a pretty good spark plug.
Thank you very much, David, for joining us tonight. We're just weary of the time, so you can get home at a reasonable hour. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Happy to do this, and I think it's a great program you have. I was looking at some of your stuff, and you got a terrific focus on issues and public policy. So congratulations, and happy to chat at any other time if it's good for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So we're approaching the end of the podcast. So what do you guys think is something we should look out for or be on the lookout for in terms of the federal carbon plan?
I think the first thing is really just where we're going to go after 2022. I think that we've kind of discussed it today, and we've heard that this plan is here, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. We'll see what happens in 2019 with the federal election, but it seems to be here for now. We also acknowledge that we need to do more to meet our Paris targets and to meet the IPCC target. So whether it's an increased price after 2022 or if it's more investment in energy diversification, those are important steps. So I think the political climate is something to look out for, and just where we go next.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. I think also another main issue to keep in mind as we move forward as well is the interplay between the provinces and the federal government, and how Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick move forward from here, and how their premiers move on from this point. Yeah,
I think something that people should be wary of moving forward is paying attention to how Ontario and Scott Moe pursue this federal Supreme Court lawsuit against the Division of Powers. If this is something the federal government can, in fact, make a tax on, we should look out until see how the price of the rebate changes, or if the price on carbon itself changes in the near future. And I think something finally would be to look at how the money gets invested, if it will continue to be into soft social infrastructure, or if it will go into something more conducive to climate action, such as R&D and clean investment or clean tech. So thank you very much for listening to The Weekly, and we're looking forward to you tuning in next week. Thanks.